Good morning, Cindy. How are you?
I'm very well. How are you, Dennis?
I'm doing so well. Thank you so much for joining us today. Well, for the next 30 minutes,
Thank
as
you
I
for
talk,
having me.
yeah, you're welcome. As I talked about off the top, we're gonna talk about teenagers, and I'm a parent. For full transparency, I've got a 20-year-old daughter, but I know all the trials and tribulations, and not having a handbook all these years about how to navigate with a teenager all those years. And there are some great things and some not so great things, but being a kid from the 70s, life was so much simpler for me. No social media, no internet. Our parents kind of parented us, but they didn't, so it's so different now that parents, and I'm speaking for myself, are so close to their children today. So with all that said, as you talk with families and teenagers, maybe go over some of the things that are on teens' minds and things that they have to deal with now. And I know the parents listening will probably be familiar with some of the subject matter that you're going to talk about, but some of the bullet points, what are they, what teens are really dealing with today?
Well, I think the pressure is on high these days, Dennis. I think that teens now, even in high school, are thinking about what are they going to do for their career. I think unlike when we were in college, Dennis, there is no such liberal arts education. Now we're talking about which career or path do you want to have, and therefore what kind of a college, if you're college bound, what kind of a major should you have when you're in even maybe junior high now. So more pressure on grades, more pressure on where you go to school, of course, within a certain group of people who are college bound, then the students that are more in the direction of a technical program. Again, though, still, how do you make your way in the world, in this world that's so much pressure? So there's that whole piece. Then, of course, there's the whole social isolation piece that kids going into their teen years are experiencing right now. They're experiencing a lack of opportunities for social contact. And social contact, as I know you know as a parent, Dennis, is so important for teens. Teens absolutely need social contact. And it is so important for their growth and development in so many ways. In fact, I was looking at an article that I just happened to see Emily Labor Warren wrote an article about the role of friendship in the teen years. And she was talking about the idea that there was a study at the University of Virginia that was looking at teens, and there were 200 students, and they were looking at teens, and they were showing that teens who had friends in high school, in their teen years, junior high and high school, those teens showed significant advancement, both academically, in romantic relationships, in their mental health, so many things. And that was such an important finding for these kids. And that without the social contact now, kids don't have the opportunity for the honest feedback that they get from their peers. So this peer contact is just not to be underrated. You have opportunities to, compromise with your peers. You have opportunities to be given feedback about how you're coming across in a way that you can't manufacture that with your parents. It's just not the same. And so kids have been really isolated at home, and even maintaining any connection is difficult. These are the years where kids are needing to connect with peers, also developmentally. So developmentally, they can't move forward if they can't move to their peers, which is their next major point of intimacy in their lives. Their intimate connections should be appropriately their peers, not their parents at home in isolation. And kids that are going into college now, or kids that are going into high school now, this is post-COVID, they're just not that prepared because they've been kind of in an isolation tank.
Cindy, you say so many interesting things, and as a parent, there's a lot to unpack there. But once again, I'll use my personal experience with my daughter. When COVID had hit, she was in offsite learning for probably about 3 months, which didn't really bug her last months of high school. But then she went to her college all masked up with so many protocols, where she didn't have that first year of college experience like we all have,
Right.
anybody
Right.
post-secondary school. And it was debilitating, because high school wasn't a lot of fun the last couple of years. And we can get into those things about teenagers too, and the treatment of your peers and social media. That's its own giant topic with all that and the pressures that they have with social media and the digital age. But those 2 years, we feel like, as we talked to her about it too, were almost stolen from her. And those
Exactly.
are formidable years for them too. And she's our only child, and I know there's a lot of parents that have multiple children, but there's also a lot that have just one child like we did. And I think that a lot of parents would relate with me by saying your child is pretty much very close to you with an only child, sometimes too close to you. They know a lot of intimate
Exactly.
details about you and things that you
Right.
necessarily share with your child because they're so close. And the pandemic even brought that closer together. And then the isolation of it. So, unlike what we would have done normally if she was at college, even though she was about an hour away, car drive, was we let her come home during the pandemic because it was so isolating and so weird at college that she wanted to be around people that loved her, safe haven at home. But I wonder, as you talk to families now, with all that said, I imagine that the data over the coming years, the next 5-10 years, is going to be extraordinary to see how the pandemic not only has affected the family dynamic, but teens going from high school to college and what that's done to them long term. I imagine that fascinates you. I'm sure a lot of it won't be positive, but it nonetheless fascinating and what's going to come out of it.
Yeah. And I think a lot of tough things. I think that what we're seeing now, I mean, I don't have any proof of this, and I'm sure more articles will be written in the near future. Trust me on that one, Dennis. But I think that one of the things that I'm seeing, just as kind of anecdotally from patients that I work with in treatment, is that, their kids are a little on the young side coming out of this kind of isolation. That, some of the bumps and bruises that you get by growing up, by the process of being more out on your own. Like going to high school is a process. It's a whole rite of passage. It's a kind of its own hazing. You know, they're the in group and the out group, and you have to figure out, where are you and how do you manage that, and how do you navigate and make connections in the face of that. But when you don't have those opportunities, you're more of a babe in the woods, and you don't really actually know what to do, and you're not skillful. And so you feel even more sort of insecure and unclear about how to move forward, and you need more bolstering and support from your parents. So I anticipate this generation, I think, could kind of go, it's kind of bifurcated. Either they're hyper independent, or they're a little bit unsure, timid, unclear about how to move forward. So I think we're going to probably see some of both as a result of what we've just been through
You
with
know,
this
I
pandemic.
I would tend to agree with you because I see both of those characteristics in my daughter. I see a lot of
Uh-huh.
independence. She went over to London this past semester and completely adulted for 4 months. Went through
Mhm.
Omicron and everything else, which was extraordinary. And there's no help. We're over the pond. So how are we going to jump in and help out if we could anyway? But the other thing is too is that I just see it's not neediness. It's just I do like the closeness that we have, and I see that in a lot of parents that are friends of ours that have an only child. The love, the attention, the special relationship that you have. But I think as a parent, and my wife and I talk about this all the time, and I'm sure this is until the dawn of time when you start having kids. Is my kid going to be able to survive out in the wild? You know,
Absolutely.
you give them all the things, all the tools to succeed, but you worry about, because I know what I've been through in my life, and I'm a 70s kid, so I was just thrown out there. I'm a survivor like every other 70s kid out there. It's different for them because of the closeness that we have in our family dynamic. And, listen, we spoiled our child just like probably any other family would with an only child. But we also tried to make our child self-sufficient, being able to do laundry, cook for yourself, know how to bank, fill up your gas tank, the normal things that you need to do to survive out there. But you always have that worry as a parent, are they going to be able to tough it out when they get into the real world after college?
And that's where the experience of then going off and studying abroad is such a wonderful growth opportunity, and a way to kind of recoup some of what was lost there.
Right.
That, then getting out and, like, having your redo year, like, okay, you didn't get to be away, but now you do. And
Yeah.
so now you're going to go out there and you're going to knock them dead and figure it out. And so being away from home is especially important in an only child situation, because at least when children are at home with other children, they still get a lot of that peer development along the way. They play with their siblings, they have to negotiate, but that becomes extremely important in a single child family, because a lot of that peer development of negotiating, sharing, asserting oneself in relationships, taking turns, all those social skills that come from engagement with others that could happen at home, even though there's a pandemic, can't even happen at home. You're with your parents, which of course you're still working on skills, but it's not the same as doing it with your peers,
Yeah.
or in a college dormitory,
Right.
or in some kind of shared housing environment in a college setting, right? So
Real life experiences. And that makes a lot of
exactly.
sense. And
There's
Cindy,
nothing that can make up for that, right? There's nothing.
couldn't agree more with you. I'd like to back up just a little bit and talk a little bit more about school, because it reminded me about ACT and SATs and the extra training that we did our last year and a half, and the pressures that not only the school brought upon our family, but it's also the pressures that our child brought on upon herself about going to college. And a lot of it is the great unknown. They don't know because you don't know it. What's college going to be like? How hard is it going to get in? How many offers? How many rejections am I going to get? There's so many different elements that go into that. And I wonder if you could give any advice for any of the families out there, because I can tell you unequivocally that last year and a half in our house was a pressure cooker for all three of us, my wife, my daughter, and myself, about extra learning for ACT, colleges that you want to go to, actually physically going to see what campus you fall in
There's a
love
whole
with. I
process.
mean, it is endless, folks. And then
Yeah.
the expense that will come with that, whether you're in state or out of state. I could go on and on, but maybe you could impart some advice when it's turning into a pressure cooker for a family. What are some things when it comes to communication, or the lack of communication that families have, when everybody is at their wits' end and everything is on the line to get into that certain college?
So I would say, first of all, everybody needs to take a beat. Let's slow this train down and let's just take a look. The truth of the matter is, there are a lot of really good colleges out there. There's a lot of opportunity out there for those kids, again, that are college bound, because some people are going to technical school. Some people aren't sure they want to go to college. That's a whole nother kind of pressure. Some students are demonstrating, both with their behavior and their grades, that they're just not ready for this and they might need to take a gap year. And I think more and more parents are getting ready for that kind of alternative. And in your case, it sounds like your daughter, it was more of a pressure cooker and wanting to get right into the right school. And what I would just say is, there's more than one right school, and that having support, sometimes there can be a college counselor out there who could help guide you either with the school that you're at, or you can hire one privately, but getting somebody who really knows the ropes to work with you. Often in school settings, whether it's private school, public school, there is a college counselor there to help with that. And they can really kind of walk you through what it all is. But finding out who knows and getting those answers is important. There's no reason parents need to figure this all out. It's kind of like figuring out how to get ready for a fire drill in the middle of a fire, right? You don't need to do that. That's just, that doesn't make sense. And neither does this make sense. So knowing, hey, guess what? College, it's a big deal. Do you want to go? When do you want to go? Where do you want to go? How do we prepare for this? What are the steps we take? Guess what? There's information about all this out there, and there isn't a reason to stress about it. And there isn't a reason also that it should all be on parents. There are plenty of services out there to support students in writing their essays and figuring these things out. Both, some people have resources to pay for that. Other people can do that in creative ways. You can do swaps where families get together and swap kids and say, well, I'll read your kid's essay, you read mine, and that you don't have the parent doing all the work of this, because that really strains the relationships between parents and kids. And I would also say to parents, it's very, very important that you let your kid tell you what they want to do, because parents sometimes don't do that. They presume a lot about the right way forward, how we're going to do this. and they don't let their children talk with them about things that parents might think of as less popular. Some parents think, well, you should just go to college. Everybody goes to college. Well, guess what? Everybody doesn't go to college. That's one thing. Some people go to technical school. That's also a great route. Okay. Some people just need a little break between high school and college, and parents working with kids around who are their kids and what do their kids need to flourish during this time and to really own their own reality as much as possible. Because again, this is a time of transition to more autonomy. So this generation of parents has a tendency to be helicopter parents. And by that, I mean they zoom in too close and take too much charge in the face of anxiety, and a certain subgroup of the culture here of, educated parents want so much for their children to have so many things. And that's great, but not at the cost of the child having their experience. It's not just the destination, Dennis, it's the process. We have to let our kids walk through this process and have their journey. We don't want them to have it later, out of view, when it's totally overwhelming on their own. We want them to have it now, when they're in the safety of home, and they can begin to manage some of the frustrations and disappointments and excitement and all of it, and begin to do, again, more skill building and coping strategies. Because sometimes when kids get to college, they bail out or they melt down because they're not prepared for what's coming next. And they don't even understand basic things about like how high school is different than college. Like in high school, you get a handout to do and you do it and you bring it back. In college, you get a syllabus for the entire semester. Some kids don't even know that till they get to college, and they have to manage their whole semester and all their projects on their own. Now, as you get later as a high school student, you understand that, but earlier as a high school student, you might not understand that. And depending on how involved parents are, that's a whole nother piece. If you're very involved with your kids, you're actually crutching them, because later they need to be able to do this on their own. They don't need you hovering about them. They need to get their sea legs and figure out how to do these skills on their own.
I'm glad you brought that up. And listen, the helicopter parent generation that I happen to be guilty of, because I'm part of that generation. I imagine that with all of your teachings and your knowledge with working with family dynamics and teenagers going from high school to college, there is a fine line between wanting what's best for your child and then not allowing them to make all the decisions and start that adulting phase. So that was just my 2 cents on that. We'll talk about that at a different time. But I did want to also talk about the transition of high school to college and empty nest. For us, one child, one and done, it's alarming. And, going into that empty room is emotional.
Oh, it is. It is. It's so emotional.
Multiple kids, it's a little bit different, but still there eventually comes that time. What would you say to parents? Let's go from my case. If you have just one child, what kind of preparation would you like to see them do as far as communication and get prepared for when their child's not going to be at home regular anymore? Because I can speak from experience. They're there for 18 years and then they are gone, and it is unsettling. It happens very quickly, and nothing changes it. And it's an emotional roller coaster ride, isn't it?
It most certainly is. And I am also a mother of a single child, and it's kind of shocking, actually. Like, you're not quite ready for it.
Yeah.
And then it just happens. And, you were the one driving them here and there and with them in the morning and in the evening and going on holiday and doing all these things with them. And now it's just quiet. And figuring out how to navigate that for yourself and with your child is very important, because what you're talking about is the beginning of a process of negotiating an adult relationship with your child. So you're wanting them to move toward adulthood. And the college process is kind of the conduit to adulthood that happens in our culture. College is kind of our nesting period for becoming an adult, is one way to say it. Now, there are other ways to do that if you're not going to college, including these technical schools. You're in a technical school for 2 years, or you're following after someone and tracking someone and learning from them as like being mentored by someone in a role as a mechanic or various other jobs. So there are lots of ways to do this. It doesn't have to just be college. Then, of course, there's also the junior college approach where you go first to junior college and then on to college, which can have a lot of benefits as well. But I guess back to the original point, you can't really know what that feels like until you're there, but it's good to at least know it's coming. And for you as a couple, it's good to be planning ahead and thinking about getting ready for being empty nesters, because you can't, once that happens, then you really do have to pivot and figure out how to recraft a relationship with both your child and your partner. And so, like, for instance, when they go off to college, how often do you want to call them? Do you want to have a plan that you speak to them once a week? Who's going to call? Do you want to always be the one calling? Do you want them to plan to call? How do you navigate that? Same thing with holidays. Guess what? College students don't want to spend every holiday with their parents. Right?
For sure.
They sure don't. Did you, Dennis? I sure didn't. We all
No.
want to go off with our friends and go on holiday with our friends, right? And
Yeah.
visiting other people's homes and those sorts of things. That's another thing I would say. One of the ways to stay connected to your kids, which is important because they still need you, even though they may not realize it, they still do need you to be solid for them for a good long time, well into their 20s.
You're right about that. I think the one thing that my wife, especially my wife, because she is so close to my daughter, and I'm sure a lot of moms out there who have daughters that are very close, even sons too. I just do both of them. The hurt feelings that you have as the separation happens.
Yes.
And it is very difficult, especially if you're super close to your child. Once again, only child like you and your husband. And there's a lot of parents out there that have gone through this about just the hurt feelings about the massive changes and not being with them regularly. There's a time when you just wanted them out of the house because they were driving you crazy. And now that they're gone, the missing and the heart hurting about that, it's an incredible journey for a parent, but boy, there's a lot of heartache going on there.
Well, and I would say that the thing you don't want to do is to unnecessarily burden your child with your hurt feelings.
Yes.
You don't want them to feel it's a thankless job parenting, really, Dennis, because our job is for them to fly solo. That's what they're supposed to do. That is what is expected, that they grow up and that they're self-supporting and that they go on to lead their lives. And if we interrupt that, we're really interrupting something important. So it's actually quite a critical juncture in the life of a human to figure out how can we navigate this precipice without it being such a frightening experience for anyone in the family, that we all know we're up against something and we all know that we're sad. And kids are sad too, It's not just parents, kids are too. They may or may not be able to tell you yet, but they miss their parents. They miss the comfort of home. But on the other hand, they're very excited to get out, as well they should be. And we don't want to put that burden where they're worrying about us and we're sad and they have to take care of us now. That is not what we want. We want to be standing there clapping for them and waving goodbye. Of course, they need to treat parents with respect. And that's a tricky part. How do you language that with your children? Look, I am here to support you through thick and thin. I wish you well on your journey. And here's some things that I would like from you. I'd like to still feel like you want to talk with us, that you want to see us. I don't want to feel like I'm a burden to you or an obligation, right? At the same time, though, let's not be surprised when who would they really like to be with? Their buddies, their boyfriend, their girlfriend, right?
Yeah,
That's
but
who they really want to be with. And that need not hurt somebody's feelings.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought this up. We have about 5 minutes left, and we could talk for hours about this, but I want to specifically bring up the dynamic. When you and I were growing up in the 70s, our parents just released us into the wild, so it was a much different dynamic than we have today. We're so much, in general terms, so much closer to our children, which what you're talking about all makes perfect sense. But because of the difference between us and our parents and how we brought up our children, I think we put so much of a burden and pressure on ourselves where they didn't even have to worry about those things, and you just kind of released your kid into the wild, and that was that. It's so much more difficult for today's parents because we know so much about them. They know so much about us. We're so much closer to them. There's so many more challenges in this busy, difficult, crazy world with social media, the internet, and just all the things that we see on television and hear on the radio and read online that are happening. And I think that's the inherent difference. That my point is, our parents have nothing on us, number one. And number two, I just think it's a much more difficult, without having that handbook once again, Cindy, to release the kid into the wild and let them do their thing. I just think it's harder on parents today. I really do.
I think it is too. And I think one big difference is, parenting has changed. Parents are responding to the way they were parented.
Yeah,
They were parented with a much more hands-off approach. Now the whole focus in parenting is mental health, mental wellness,
that's right.
emotional connection. So we've really swung again to another end of things. And so some of what's lost is that, this notion of respecting your parents, which we were raised with, these kids are not. It's not the same. In fact, I know many, many kids who call their parents by their first name even. It's a very different dynamic. And we have to be careful to understand the difference between empathy and identification.
Mm-hmm.
And our stories were very different than theirs. So we can look at our kids and feel like we understand them because we were them, but guess what? We weren't. And our experiences are very different. And identification is not the same as empathy. Seeing your child for who they are and understanding their story for what it really is, not their story through our lens of our story, that's a very important thing to keep in mind. We don't know how they feel. And the way we're going to find out is to ask them. And the way we ask them is to stay connected. And staying connected means being curious and empathic.
I'm glad you said that too, because there was a time when my daughter was probably going through her early teenage years. And I started, when I got upset about something, that my daughter wouldn't listen to me, or I had experience from when I was growing up. And my wife had to settle me down, said, your experiences back in the 70s and the 80s don't apply to our daughter today. And you have to separate, for lack of a better phrase, church and state when it comes to that your experiences are completely different than hers. And you're going to have to stop using your old experiences in these new situations. So it took me some, time outs for myself to, take a deep breath and understand about exactly what my wife was saying to me. And she was correct on it too, that I've got a new person in front of me, and my experiences basically mean squat when it comes to what she's experiencing now, and to stop using the old days and move forward with the new days. So it's all such fascinating stuff, Cindy, and we only have a couple minutes left, and there's so much more to talk to you about in coming interviews that we're going to do a lot. We're going to talk about family dynamics. We're going to talk about social media and the effect on adolescents and teens, and how it's affected everybody, not only emotionally, but physically, and mental health and wellness that you had talked about a little bit. There's so many different topics that we can chat about with the family dynamic. I just want to let everybody know that, when it comes to being a parent, you can read all the handbooks and you can see all the therapists, but you just have to kind of sit back, communicate, and make your best decisions, what you think for your family out there. But I've noticed, Cindy, the one thing, and I bet you too as a parent, is that I stopped asking questions, because it's easy for a parent to drill your kid with questions, especially in the high school years. But when my wife and I stopped asking questions, our child started offering more up at the dinner table or anywhere else. And that's one piece of unsolicited advice I can give to parents. Don't pepper them with questions. Take a breath, let them tell you on their own timeline. And it really paid off for us, Cindy. It really did.
Well, I also think being curious about them in a non-pressured way. You're not drilling them with questions with your agenda. That's the difference. That if you're actually just curious with them, and you're interested in what they're talking about, and you're most importantly relaxed, and you don't need to hear a particular answer, that lands very, very differently. That's not peppering them with questions. That's being with them.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Cindy, I can't tell you how much I've appreciated your time today. We could go on forever. And listeners, we're going to visit with Dr. Cindy Post a lot. So stay tuned for more conversations. But thank you so much for joining us on
Thank you.
Community DC. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. So people, if they're wanting to reach out to me, are able to reach me at cynthiapostphd.com if there's a need to be in touch. I've really enjoyed talking with you today, Dennis. Thank you so much. I look forward to talking to you again soon.
You're quite welcome. Thank you so much.
All right.
Oh.
Bye-bye.